So the movie I want to discuss is a very obvious one, probably because it's quite recent and quite well known. And in my experience of watching art house Danish movies that tend to be really traumatic, this one is actually a beautiful comedy, but with a serious heart and serious emotional payoff. It's called Another Round, or how do you pronounce this in Danish? Is it Druk?
Druk.
Okay, cool. And it was released in, I guess, 21. I mean, I saw it in October 2020 in the first lockdown London Film Festival, so at home, which was kind of weird. But it was just the movie in that horrible year that I needed, because it was a movie all about friendship and joyous release by the end. But it reflected some of the dark backing of the world. So the concept is you've got four old friends, kind of middle-aged, middle-class Danish men, kind of in that Talking Heads song. Is this my beautiful wife? Is this my beautiful car? How did I get here? You know, they're sort of, you know, superficially kind of okay. Like one's the Mads Mikkelsen character as a high school teacher. They're all living, you know, good enough lives, I guess, but maybe hitting a bit of a midlife crisis. And they meet for a dinner and they have this conversation where one says there's this anecdote that apparently, scientifically, the optimal blood alcohol level is just ever so slightly intoxicated. So not so intoxicated people would notice, but just a little bit to take the edge off. So they all decide that they're going to try, for science, a cockamamie experiment where every day they just try and keep their blood alcohol level just a little bit elevated, and to see what that does to them, like to report back and see what happens. And at first, it seems like it's really working. They feel more confident, more loose, more happy. The Mads Mikkelsen character at the start is this high school teacher who clearly does not engage with his students at all, and they're really unimpressed with him. And then with that little bit of alcohol, kind of turns into like the teacher in Dead Poet Society, where he's super inspirational. So it all seems to be going well, but they don't stop there, obviously, human beings being what they are. So then they decide to raise it even a little bit higher. And this is where the movie gets a little bit darker and more profound, because they show that at this point then they are turning up to work drunk, and it is having an impact on their families. You know, they feel still like they're having the time of their lives, but you do see the impact of their drinking on their surroundings. And, you know, as someone who's experienced alcoholism in my wider family and friendship group, that really I found very moving as a portrayal, because it's not full-blown alcoholism at this point, but you are already seeing the impact it's having on their wider group of people who love them and know them. And then, obviously, you get the idea that self-medication doesn't really tackle the underlying problem. So for some of them, bar one, there is that capacity to realise they've gone too far and to pull back. And sadly, spoilers for one of them, it's just kind of exacerbated what was already a lot of underlying frustration and pain. And he ends up not surviving the film, if I put it in that vague term, in case anyone wants to watch it and not be utterly spoiled. And I think that's I was wondering when I sort of started watching it how they were going to tackle the dark side of drinking. And I think it's really important that the director Thomas Vinterberg did tackle that and did show that. So what then happens as you reach the sort of the final act of this film, where this guy who was already depressed, it's been exacerbated and he hasn't come through this experiment, is that somehow, you know, the friendships survive. They kind of revert to their normal lives, sort of older, wiser, probably more profoundly. And Mads Mikkelsen, who knew, had completed dance training in real life. Before he became an actor, he wanted to be a dancer, never had that idea. And there's this wonderful cathartic scene at the end, which I think is the one that sort of became very well known and kind of is probably what won a lot of people's hearts about this movie, where he's having his final can and he stumbles across a group of high school kids who've just had their final day at school and are just like hanging out by the shore, by the water. And they're dancing to some cheesy dance music, and he just joins in and starts dancing in this incredibly unstructured, loose, but really kind of cathartic, passionate way. and ends with this final wonderful, joyous leap into the water, almost like cleansing himself of this experience that he's gone through. And it's just so amazing. I mean, I think it just felt like, God, wouldn't we all want to do that in the midst of second lockdown? So I really love this film. I think Thomas Vinterberg, who directed it and also co-wrote it, it's this beautiful balance because some of the scenes are just so elegantly put together and so elegantly filmed. This isn't dogma. It's much more, in a way, polished, controlled than that. In the emotional scenes, it's incredibly intimate, which I think you do get that carry through from Dogma, this idea that it does feel like real relationships and real conversations rather than something too stagey and dramatic. I think that the co-writer, Tobias Lindholm, as well, deserves praise. It's a very truthful script. I mean, as I enter that kind of age cohort of the characters, I think some of the stuff it tackles about frustration, feeling your big life choices have been made, opportunities closing down, sort of, it feels so truthful, but it's also really, really funny. And getting that balance right, I think, is probably pretty tricky to do. So it did the festival circuit. It won lots of audience awards. So I think at Toronto it got the audience award. London, it was hugely popular, and then obviously it went on to be nominated for and win lots of Best Foreign Film Awards of 2021. So I think it did really, really well. And deservedly so. I mean, it's rare to find a film that you love that you wouldn't change a single thing. Like, even some of my all-time favorite films, there are little things I would tweak. But this one I just think is an absolutely beautiful film and a real showcase for all of the lead actors. And I think you get to see Mads Mikkelsen in a different light, which I love. You know, I just think it's really fantastic. And I hope you guys enjoyed it too.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. This is my first time watching it. And I found it very engaging. I didn't necessarily find it comedic. I thought it erred more on the dramatic side. I found it was more just sort of enjoyable, like the scenes of them having fun and running amok with each other definitely made me crack a smile, but not as much a comedic tone as I was expecting. But I really enjoyed it. I thought it was really well-drawn characters. You really felt their pain and their frustration, and that sense of finding their groove back again. I thought it did a good job sort of contrasting the spirit and the energy and the hopes and dreams of all the young students with these four men who feel like, yeah, they're past their best years and their dreams have had to be sort of compromised, and they've kind of got everything they wanted in a way, or they've achieved these comfortable lives. But the spirit that had sort of moved them when they were younger has kind of dissipated in some way. So it's a film about midlife crisis that I think is really well performed. And I think that the film definitely rests on the performances, especially Mads Mikkelsen, and his transformation as a character throughout the film is really impressive. Especially those scenes in the classroom where he's so done and defeated and just on autopilot. You can see the confusion and disappointment in his students, and then him being able to transition into this really passionate, engaging teacher is really enjoyable and uplifting. And I thought the film it's an interesting commentary on alcoholism, on drinking rather, because it doesn't necessarily condemn it, and in some ways it condones it by the end of the film. It's basically saying, like, as human beings, we are really anxious, and sometimes we need to take the edge off or let off some steam. And it can go too far, obviously, but you know, it's not necessarily a bad thing. And sometimes you do need to let loose, and that's part of being human, is kind of getting out of your own head at times and just losing control. So yeah, I thought it was a really good film from start to finish. I loved it.
Yeah, and I think you just hit on something that's very, thematic, like very Danish in a sense. That point of saying that alcohol is good for something. It's good for getting rid of some inhibitions, or just getting away from what's holding you back to begin with, and then you can be your true self. That's at least the way of Danish people use alcohol as a tool for socializing or acting in a social arena. the way it's emblematic of Denmark is also because in both in Norway and in Sweden, they have like a lot of they have a different culture around alcohol. It's either controlled by the state or just very expensive in general because too much alcohol is not good for you. So they put taxes on it so that it becomes expensive to drink too much. But in Denmark, we've always had like a culture of you'll handle it yourself, right? Everyone is expected to learn how to handle alcohol as they turn into an adult. So they drink a lot of young people in Denmark. They drink a lot during high school and maybe also a bit of uni. But as time goes on, they're expected to sort of find a balance. Not to stop. I think it's actually it's become more accepted now not to drink and have like a decision. I don't drink at parties, but it's still in some arenas it's still sort of you're always offered a drink when you go to a party, even though you might not want to begin with. So it's very much embedded in our culture, and this movie shows very well that there's no expectation of you not drinking or finding out that you want to completely drop drinking, but find the balance in your life. That's also a very important thing about alcohol for Danish people.
Yeah, I think it also does a good job showing the socialization of drinking and the peer pressure that obviously it's a big part of the being a student or being a graduate is celebrating, and you certainly don't want to be excluded from that celebration or that social cohort and their rituals. But also even among the four men, like there's every scene where one of them starts to doubt or starts to err on the side of caution around drinking. The three others, encourage him. No, come on, join us for a drink, have a bit more, give it a go. So you can see how so much of it is a social element or a social lubricant or a ritual that you don't want to be excluded from, because it's not so much the alcohol you're missing, but it's that social connection and being on the same wavelength as everyone else, because no one wants to be the only sober one at a party, because it's just you're on a different wavelength from everyone else.
A couple of comments on that. I thought it was really interesting what Patrick said about in Denmark having a different attitude towards drinking, that you'll kind of figure it out yourself, because I think that is the perception of not Denmark but Sweden during the pandemic. Like you guys know what's sensible, figure it out. Whereas other countries went for more sort of mandatory measures, which I think is really fascinating. Maybe that's just part of being a more sort of progressive, sensible country, that you can take that attitude. And I think the movie did capture the peer pressure really well. And something we've noticed recently as we're not drinking anymore is that it's always the default that you will, this idea that you go to a party, someone will just offer you a drink and you almost have to give a reason why not. I'm driving, or I'm on medication. The default setting is a wine glass at the table, right, in our societies. And it really made me think about that. And it's something I've observed recently as well and been really thinking about. It's quite an interesting thing in Western culture, isn't it? That socializing defaults to also drinking. But yeah.
And the way that the film presents it as both this kind of rowdy, debaucherous explosion with the kids, but also in the restaurant, it's presented in this very refined, sophisticated sort of gastronomic experience that you couldn't possibly exclude that ingredient from that experience. But it's the same substance. It's just presented in different ways to different classes or different ages of people.
Yeah, so it's a sophisticated representation. It's almost like, here, we're going to give you the facts. Yes, if you're an introverted, disengaged, disenfranchised teacher, maybe it does make you temporarily better at some point and more kind of, overcoming your inhibitions and frustrations. But then look at this dark underbelly to it. So I feel it is quite, to your point, it is quite a non-judgmental film. It's just this is the impact it could have in various ways. We'll figure out where you sit on that line, which is really grown up. I'm not sure this film, tackling over drinking and some of its tragic consequences, could or would have been made in this way in America or England. In In fact, I'm almost certainly sure it wouldn't have been.
No, it's certainly drinking to excess is almost universally depicted as a problem, as either the practice of a sort of villainous character or a kind of a fall from grace, a fall into violence and abuse and negative, toxic behavior. It's rarely shown as a tool of, I don't know, certainly drugs are in different movies, but alcohol is, often a villainous substance in film.
Yeah, and there's a reason why people drink, right? We're not all morons. So if we get in trouble for drinking too much, it's because at first it is intensely pleasurable and it does bring benefits, right? And release and catharsis. So I think it's honest about, like when I watch a lot of drug films, like doing drugs always so miserable. And I think, well, there's a reason people start doing them, right? Because at the start it does feel better. So you've got to be honest about that. The other thing I quite liked about the film is, like, there's, in mainstream Western films, there's a lot of buddy movies. Like, so male friendship is always seen in the context of like two guys, like typical buddy cop movies, I guess. Like sort of typically quite different in personality. It's quite rare to see a group of men having fun together or going through life together and being very honest about or not honest about their emotions and the real shit they're going through. And I was just trying to think of other films I know where there's an ensemble of men just dealing with life. And it just feels that was very unique. And maybe that's why it resonated, because people hadn't seen much of it before and there was a need for it. Maybe also in the second lockdown, when I feel that going through lockdown, a lot of my friends who were female found it easier to use virtual and social media to keep up with each other. Whereas a lot of the guys, without that, let's all go down the pub on a Thursday night and have a chat and shoot the breeze, that they almost found it harder to transition to that online life. And maybe that speaks to the popularity of this film.
Yeah, and I guess it can be a very gendered thing, depending on what you're drinking, but the idea of going to the pub to drink beer is traditionally a very male thing. And that is a way for male gathering or male bonding to occur outside the home. So that is a ritual maybe that was disrupted by the pandemic, but that's certainly something you see in this film. But I thought it was interesting that 2 films in a row from Denmark are about 4 middle-aged men going through midlife crisis, Flickering Lights and Another Round.
Yeah, I can't even name 2 films that are British that have 4 middle-aged men dealing with life.
Sorry.
And I've seen a lot more British film than Danish film.
Yeah, it is very, I think it is the contract of trying to go to something maybe not always realistic but true. Like the feeling is true of and from Thomas Vinterberg or Anders Thomas Jensen or any of those directors, I think you have to speak to what you know. Really, I think that's the story you need to tell, and this is a very the theme of having men not knowing whether or not they're on the right track of their life is, I think probably sure there's some people who are completely figured out by the time they hit midlife. But I think it's more true that most of us need to confront our mortality at some point, and usually in the midlife time of their life. And yeah, it is good that these movies come out to help the future people in midlife crisis to reflect on at least what to do and what not to do, how far it can go out. If you want to find yourself, please don't do as one of the people in this movie, at least, right?
Yeah. Another thing I really enjoyed about the film was the camera work and how it almost embodies their different levels of sobriety or intoxication. Like the early scenes in the film are very still and dimly lit, and the sound is almost muted in a way. But then as they start to drink, the camera almost sort of swings back and forth towards the character to imitate this kind of slightly off-balance feeling, and kind of swings back and forth, but it also gives it this liveliness. And then when they're getting really drunk, for example, in the store, or after Martin finds out about his wife's infidelity, it almost sort of becomes chaotic, or it's following you almost can't keep up with the characters as they crash and stumble around a room. And then the final scene is amazing. Like it's this sort of almost perfect fluidity where the camera is just swimming around the scene, around all these dancing students following Martin as he does this amazing dance performance, swinging back and forth, underneath, over the top, cartwheeling, and then jumping into the ocean. It's just so fluid and perfect.
One of the reviewers in England just said it was almost as if the camera was in on the experiment.
Mm.
So it was becoming drunker as they became drunker, and then as Martin was having his cathartic moments, so it was the camera. It had found the perfect balance between static introversion and the sort of more kind of slightly chaotic, and had just become pure elegant dance. And I thought that was really nice putting it.
Yeah, elegance. And another word they use to describe it is poise. You're more poised when you just have a little bit to drink. And yeah, it's such an amazing final scene. Like it's so uplifting, and it just leaves you on such an amazing feeling.
And also, if you couldn't admire Mads Mikkelsen more, phenomenal actor, really good looking, seems to be a genuinely nice guy. He hasn't let his fame go to his head. And then he turns out to be an amazing trained dancer as well.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting that. I thought it'd be like a double or something that would do it, but it was all him. And that made it all the better that you could see his face. Yeah,
so we listened to a Q&A with Thomas Vinterberg after the film, like a sort of Zoom version of that. And they were like, people were asking about it, and he was like, yeah, so we thought we were going to have to get in a choreographer and sort of figure this out. And it turned out like none of us knew that he actually is like a really amazing dancer. And he was so excited to be able to dance.